So from here out tonight, I'll do a quick introduction. But the main point of tonight is to hear the consultant report of what they've been working on. So that'll be the bulk of the presentation, and then I'll come back and just do a short little thing on what's next. So just to be clear, this is the existing Edmonds Marsh that the city owns. It's a city park. The area in red is the Unical property, Harbor Square, the marina, the railroad. There's existing railroad bridges right here that were put in for the purpose of restoring the estuary. So we're fortunate that that's there. So so that's last week. And that's right next to the Unical property in the city park. Taken by Greg Ferguson, went out and put a wildlife camera out there with permission from Parks. But anyway, the camera has now recorded otters. That otter was sitting on a beaver dam, and so he's filmed the beavers coming and going, coyotes, raccoons, rabbits, rats. So the goal is to restore the estuary. If we do that, we will have juvenile Chinook salmon that are migrating along the shoreline come in and use it. Juvenile Chinook are already using the Meadowdale Beach Restoration Project, so we're confident that'll happen. It's great bird habitat, of course. We'll provide better flood protection for Harbor Square, education, passive recreation. Quickly, the history, 1872. Pretty detailed survey. This was the marsh from the toe of the hill at Port Edmonds all the way out to where the ferry terminal is, or past it. The Tulalip tribes, took this map and superimposed it on an aerial photo. So you can see, it used to be over 100 acres. Right now it's 22. If we can do this project, we'll basically double that. So here's what it looked like before with the ale. They bring oil in on ships, bring it up to the tanks, bring it down, process it, ship it out on trucks and railroad. And you can see the marsh went all the way out to the ferry terminal. And I remember driving down this and seeing marsh on both sides around 1970. So Phil's talked about this. So I'm going to skip over the cleanup, but except just mention most of the area has been excavated and replaced with clean fill. So there's only a few little, as Phil mentioned, along the washed out stormwater pipe, and a few little other hot spots. And we think a lot of these are probably gone now. Just natural remediation, either evaporation or bacteria or breaking it down. It'll be resampled. I think Phil's covered a lot of this. So 2 years ago, Greg and I wrote a grant application to NOAA and National Fish and Wildlife Service, NIFWIF. And it was submitted by the city of Edmonds. And we were lucky enough to win the grant. And so here we are. The grant contract is between the city and NIFWIF. It's a little over $200,000 project. The city hired Blue Coast Engineering, which we're thrilled about because they're the best in the Northwest on coastal engineering. And so that's it. So with us tonight, as Phil mentioned, Jessica and Kathy. Kathy's going to talk about the findings and the findings. Kathy Ketteridge, Blue Coast Engineering.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully this isn't fascinating, but still is kind of set a big standard here. So I'm going to talk over mostly the modeling work that I led. There was also a contamination analysis study done by a company called Hanker QEA. There's a sub-consultant test. Derek Omeron is a gentleman who did that work. He couldn't be here tonight, so I'm going to summarize his slides. I understand it pretty well. If you have some real detailed questions about it, I'll warn you ahead of time. I may not be able to answer them, but I can certainly jot them down and get answers to you if there's specific questions about that that I can't answer. And that work was done with a very focused, a very focused scope of work, and that was to look at the proposed restoration, how you might have to handle that in design, given that there could be some residual contamination within the footprint of the restoration. So that's what we'll talk about when we get to that. But for, okay, let's see if I can advance this. Right, wrong thing, of course. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is we did continued a long list of hydrodynamic modeling work that's already been done at the site. So there's been already a lot of work done. I used to work for Anchor QA, so I actually did most of that previous work as well. So I can answer questions about that if you want. But that work focused on the habitat value of opening up the marsh. So what would fish passage look like? What were the velocities in the channel? How often could fish get in and out? That sort of thing. And all of that's documented in previous reports. And it was shown that it would be accessible a good portion of the time to fish and therefore had habitat. That was kind of the focus of the previous work in a nutshell over many years. This particular modeling effort had a different focus, and it was to look at two things. First is, right now the site is tidally influenced just a small amount through that pipe system that we were talking about. Post-restoration is going to be fully tidally influenced. And so that will change water levels in the marsh and can cause some adjacent flooding concerns. So first point was to kind of quantify those and determine if, putting a berm around the marsh, for example, could contain that additional water elevation and kind of alleviate any of the flooding that might occur as part of the restoration. And then the second part of the work was to look at the benefits to flooding impacts potentially of doing a bigger excavation of the Unocal site itself. So we were allowed to go in there, take out all the fill that's been placed, perhaps excavate channels through the site itself. Would that specifically help flood impacts? So there's obviously lots of other benefits to doing that. There's habitat benefits, there's additional marsh area, all kinds of stuff like that we all kind of recognize. But this just focused specifically on whether or not a bigger excavation in that area would help any flooding that comes out of opening the marsh up to full tidal inundation. So that's what I'm going to go over. Well, you've already seen this map. So at this pointer, unfortunately, doesn't work on this screen. So I'm going to have to point with my real finger. Sorry, people that are not here, they won't be able to see this. But so everyone, you've kind of seen this map already. Bill already went over it. But again, so this is the marsh area. This is the stormwater pipe goes through here. And then the railroad bridge, I just want to point out, because I don't think he pointed it out specifically before. For those of you who don't know, it is located right here adjacent to Marina Beach Park. And if you go down there, it's currently just buried, like it's buried under sediment, hasn't been dug out. But the bridge itself is there. And that's the outlet that we have available to us to connect the marsh to Puget Sound. Okay, so we did a model of existing conditions. So how the marsh is now, and we did that for a couple reasons. First, the last model effort that was done a while ago in 2018. And that modeling software, which is developed by the Corps of Engineers, has actually gone through a lot of improvements since that time, has a lot more functionality. So we just brought the model kind of up to 2025 standards. It has just a lot of better representation of elevations and a lot of other things like that. So we just brought the model up to now conditions in terms of technology. We validated it, which basically means we ran a simulation where we know it flooded around Edmonds and made sure our model was showing what people expected. And we had that reviewed by Phil and Rob and Russell and a bunch of people to make sure, yeah, this is what everybody observed and saw. So we did that. Gives us some confidence, like our model's working right. And then we ran the existing conditions model for a bunch of flood scenarios, high tide, which does come through that pipe to some extent. So we did have that whole pipe system in the model operating like it operates. And then 100-year flow coming out of the creeks. So we ran a bunch of simulations with the model as the marsh operates today so that we can compare that to what it will be like in the future once restored. So we can see the differences in, say, like water surface elevations in the marsh, like as they would be today during a flood event and how they could be once it's actually connected to Puget Sound. So that was the purpose of doing the existing conditions work. Oops, too far. And then I already kind of talked about this, but the proposed conditions, we looked at two alternatives. One that most people have already seen with the channel that kind of snakes around most of the Utica site. And then an alternative where we actually just include that whole site in the restoration itself, including excavation and additional channels. Okay. So I'm just gonna briefly go through the existing conditions model, mostly because I just want to show you what was included. I think that would be helpful for context later on. So this kind of red outline that you see here, coupled with the blue outlines in the water, this is the extent of the model. So this is what we actually modeled in the computer. And what we included was the blue line was a tidal boundary. So the tide, the water's surface elevation is allowed to go up and down just like a tide along that blue line. And then we put a lot of freshwater input into the model as well. So Willow Creek flows are added into it. Chillabarger Creek flows are, and then these little smaller blue dots you see are stormwater flows or precipitation that we know enters into the marsh. And those also are included in the model as well. It's a 2D model. So there's basically a bunch of cells that go all over this entire area. And each of those cells, you can figure out what a water surface elevation is throughout the whole area for whatever hydraulic situation that you want to get. I meant to mention this I got a bunch of stuff in here. I might get a little dense. So I'm gonna just allow anyone who has questions as I go along. Please just interrupt me or ask, because I don't want you to not understand something now. It might impact how well you understand another slide in the future. So I'll stop to just ask if there's any questions along the way as well. But I don't mind being interrupted. So with that in mind, does anybody have any questions about the model itself, like what we included or didn't include before we move on? Yes, sir.
The chain link fences along 104 that were blocked with nightshade, does your model include those removed or are in place?
Oh, that's a good question. We did not include those in the model.
Okay.
So if, for example, I'm not sure where they are, but for example, if there's water here.
You're pointing out.
Okay, but I assume that must be where they were. If water comes out of this Chillabarger marsh and would overflow the road, in the model, it is allowed to overflow.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did not include those.
The second part of that is the two culverts that go under 104. Have you had a look at those? I see them a couple of times a week.
Yeah, we had.
In pretty sad shape.
Yeah, that's a good question. We did include them in the model. We did a site visit and did some survey, make sure we get the inverts right, and everything like that. So they are included in the model as in the condition they are in.
I read somewhere they were 72-inch pipes, and in fact, they're 36. One is completely blocked and the other, so instead of 4,000 cubic inches of flow, we're down to about 250 in the one southerly pipe.
Yeah, we did model them both as they are now and with some improvements, which is essentially a clean out. And of course, they do behave better when they're cleaned out, as one would imagine. So,
great, thank you.
No, you're welcome. Are there any other questions about that? Okay. All right. There's a lot of information on the slide. I'm just going to give it a high level. So we looked at 5 different hydraulic simulations. So different combinations of tide and freshwater inflow is essentially what makes a simulation. So the first one was that validation event I talked about. So that was the December 27th, 2022 flood event where we just had a really big king tide, coupled with what we determined was about a 10-year rainfall event. So that was a pretty good event. So we used that one primarily just to kind of validate our new existing conditions model, make sure everybody else saw water is where our model was showing water was located. The rest of these were simulations we selected specifically to, again, answer that question about what happens for flooding once it's opened up and how much or could it be improved if we did additional excavation at the Unocal site. So we looked, second simulation was pretty big combination of a king tide event with 100-year inflow. So pretty bad scenario or worst scenario for flooding. Then we also looked at a king tide event with a storm surge, and that was essentially what that December 22 storm was. So it wasn't just a king tide event. It was also had a storm surge associated with it, which is a local increase in water level due primarily to winds blowing on shore for a really, really long time. They just kind of stack up water against the shoreline. You might have heard it also as pressure differences. That's usually much more a cause of storm surge when there's hurricanes, when there's a really big difference in sort of atmospheric pressure. Yes.
I didn't know it might be in there as well,
Yeah.
but more like in the Carnation Valley, or, Snoqualmie Valley, their concern about the flooding is more the early snow melts.
Yeah.
I didn't know if that's part of these studies or not.
The hydrology for the creeks we got from a study that actually evaluated their hydrology for whatever is the cause. So it is based on data. So if the flows in these creeks are caused by snowmelt, which actually I'm not sure of if what drives them, if it's rainfall plus snowmelt, it is in the data we used. So it would be included in there, even though I don't know exactly maybe what's causing, if like the snowmelt was causing additional runoff. It was in the model. We just used a model someone else developed for this.
Of the tributary flows, which
Correct.
could ride you.
Correct, yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. So we looked at a storm surge, which added about a foot to king tide elevation with that 100-year flow. Then we looked at a sea level rise scenario. So the sea level rise scenario used was 3.2 feet added on to a king tide and a storm surge. That was a pretty extreme event. The value of sea level rise we used, we got from the most, up to date when everybody's using predictions from the UW Climate Center. And this represents about 100 years, like 2100, it's not 100 years, but at 2100 sea level rise with a little less likelihood of occurrence. So the median range sea level rise is about 2.5 feet. So 50% chance of occurrence. We used one that was a little bit more conservatively high at 3.2. And then the last one was we were curious, again, kind of alluding to what folks have been talking about with the SR 104 pipe condition, is what if we routed all of that stormwater flow from that pipe into the marsh directly? Took it out of the pipe and put it into the marsh. And we evaluated that one as the last scenario that we looked at. I'm not going to show all of these because after a while, all the plots things start to look the same. So I've kind of selected the ones I think are interesting. So this is just our validation event. We're not going to talk about this too much. We can always come back to it if anyone's interested. But essentially, what you're seeing here is the blue shows the water depth, and there's a scale over here where dark blue is about 5 feet deep. And what this shows as the results of the model is where all the water went, according to our model during this event. And the red arrows show the general direction that the water escaped either Edmonds or Shalom-Barger Marsh and kind of made its way into the city. And we validated this with some photographs, sort of like the one you see over there in the lower left corner, as well as just a lot of conversations with people and observations during that time. So we went through a bunch of iterations of the existing conditions model. It didn't initially predict exactly what people saw. So we did go through some iterations until we thought we had pretty good agreement with that event, and then felt some confidence, that our model is recreating real life as best that, a model generally can. Okay, so at that point, what we did is we moved forward with modeling those two alternatives. So the way we do that, we take the existing conditions model and we just change the terrain, change the elevation to match a proposed alternative. So this is the first one. And this is the one most people have probably seen in terms of restoration alternatives, where you see we're kind of avoiding the majority of the Unocal site, kind of leaving it alone, leaving the marsh alone for the most part. We did not, we made this channel a little more succinct. This is all LiDAR that we got a lot of this from. So LiDAR doesn't always pick up small channels. So I didn't, but several of our Blue Coast staff tromped around in there with Greg and Phil's help and found a channel that is indeed in there. We didn't clean out the pipes per se, but we did clear the LiDAR out so that flow could get to them, which in reality does occur. It's just not shown in the LiDAR. And then the alternative includes kind of the sinuous channel that comes down along the railroad right away, goes out under that railroad bridge. And then this is the dog park itself. So it doesn't go through the park. It kind of goes across the entrance to the park and then kind of through what's the parking lot right there. That's where that channel is going currently. And then there's also talked about, berming around the marsh to kind of hold in floodwaters. We did put in a berm around, that's this line you can see that kind of goes around. We put a berm around the entire marsh area, including that side of SR 104 as well. And we made it 16 feet high, not because we thought it needed to be 16 feet high, but we didn't want to do a lot of model simulations. So we made it too low, everything's flooded, we have to make it higher. So we just made it way higher than we thought, so that it wouldn't, and then we can just see how high the floodwaters would get by seeing what the floodwaters are in the marsh themselves. Are there any questions about this alternative before we show the next one?
I can just attest that your creek estimate location along 104 is pretty accurate.
Oh, great. It's always good to
I've been
get a
out there
third party opinion. Okay, awesome. Trying to think, is there anything else? No.
Oh, I have a question.
Sure.
What is LiDAR?
Oh, sorry, my fault. Yeah, so LiDAR it's actually publicly available. Anybody can get it, but it's elevation data that's usually taken from a small airplane. And they basically fly over an area and they kind of could measure the elevation of the ground. But it has some limitations. The vegetation can sometimes be a challenge. So sometimes there's a lot of vegetation in an area, they can miss some smaller features like little streams. And also it doesn't get under the water. So if you are looking at LiDAR data, sometimes you see like a big flat area, that's water, like a lake or something. It won't actually get the bottom of the lake. So that's another limitation. For us coastal engineers, it's a huge limitation because that's where we care about. So it doesn't help us much. But it does really help for things like marsh areas and stuff like that. So, and this, the surface that was used from this model has been like a long time in development. We started at Anchor QEA, and another company called Shannon Wilson also did some work and did some survey. And then we did some additional survey. So this is kind of an amalgamation of all of those data sets. So I think it's probably pretty good. I think it's pretty good representation of what's out there. Are there any other questions on that? No. Okay. You can kind of see if you go back and forth. I think that's kind of it's kind of a cheap animation. But you can kind of see what the main difference in this alternative is. We haven't really changed anything except that we've dug out the Unocal site proper by bringing it all down to marsh grade and putting channels through it. So the darker green is a little higher than the lighter green in this shading scheme. So we, since we're trying to find out if by digging out the Unocal site and putting in channels will actually help flooding, we just kind of went for the big dig. We figured if the big dig didn't help, then any smaller excavations certainly also would, change flooding impacts. So we just went ahead and kind of picked a bookend scenario. So we just went ahead and took out most of the area and then put some channels through it. So there wasn't any real thought into trying to work around contamination necessarily. Again, we were really looking at flooding impacts. And so we just went ahead and took out what I felt reasonably you could take out if you didn't have any limitations.
I think the beavers will appreciate this configuration more than.
More than the other one?
Yeah.
Otherwise, the channel that's south of this location.
Kathy?
Yeah.
One more question.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to know I can't see the elevation key, so I was wondering how much
currently in the marsh right now, is the Unocal site above the level of the marsh?
That's a good question. I'll go back to this one. I think this one shows it better. So basically anything that's a warmer color than this light green, so is higher. So any red or yellow.
But how much?
Yeah, how much higher?
By how much higher? Okay, that's a good question. Hold on a minute. Hopefully I'm not too.
About 10 feet. Red is 10 feet higher than the green.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, so this part right here is 10. And then this kind of orange
So not
part,
that much higher.
yeah, is maybe 8. Yeah,
Thanks.
thanks, Jessica. Okay. All right, so we're gonna go through some of the simulations that we did. Again, the purpose of these simulations was to first try to see what kind of flooding impacts, how do water levels change in the marsh if we open it up to Puget Sound and put in that channel through the railroad bridge? And how might that change, if we dig out the Unocal site more? So this is a king tide elevation without the storm surge, so still pretty big tide, and 100-year flow from the creeks. And with this is existing conditions. So this is not one of the proposed, so this is now. And this shows basically the water depths in the marsh and also the extent of flooding that would come out of either Schellenbarger or Edmonds Marsh during this pretty significant event. Then you can see there's a lot of water that escapes and goes down to SAR 104 as well as into Harbor Square and other areas. Little white star in the middle is, in a couple of slides, you're going to see I pulled out some model results that show water levels as if you just stood at one location and kind of let the tide go. It shows what the water levels, how they change. And it was taken from that star location. And you'll see that star on all the other figures. So, okay, so this is alternative 1. Same exact situation with the king tide and 100-year flow into the marsh from the creeks. And the first difference you can see is we've stopped any of the flooding through the construction of those berms that go around the marsh. So all the water is now contained in the marsh areas itself. You can see, kind of hard to see but you can kind of see that the blues get a bit darker. So the water's deeper in there. And then you can see the water in the channel as it goes out along here and then out over into onto the beach. And then this shows alternative 2, which doesn't really look any different too much in a plan view like this than alternative 1, other than you can now see that there's water in that Unocal site that we've dug out. This is where it gets interesting, and I know time series are kind of hard to look at, but they do show what's happening very well. So I'm just going to take some time to walk through this plot. So this bottom plot here with this blue line, this is the flow that's coming in from the creek. So into the model. So this is an input down here. So you can see that there's really no flow in the creek, and then there's this 100-year event. So really big peaky event. And then it stops raining. So that's what's going on down here. On this upper figure, the dotted line is the actual input as well. So that's the tide in Puget Sound. So you can see it's going up and down, 2 highs and 2 lows a day, like everybody knows. That's what that dotted line is. All the colored lines at the top are the water levels in the marsh at that star location for the 3 different situations. So for existing conditions for alt 1 and alt 2. So the turquoise arrow, I'm glad I put these arrows down because I don't think I could actually switch that to point to it. But the turquoise arrow is pointing to a turquoise line. That's the water level in.
Oh, it's very hard. I don't know if you guys can see these lines. I can't see them. So the tide is that
Yeah.
gray. Can people see that going up and down? Okay. So then this is the turquoise line. So it's below the other lines.
Thank you. It's nice to have tall partner. So the turquoise line is the water level in the marsh. And then the other 2 lines for alternatives 1 and 2, which are essentially basically on top of each other. They're the same. They're very much the same. Those are both the water levels in the marsh once opened up to Puget Sound. So the first thing to notice is that the water levels are lower now than they will be once it's opened up to Puget Sound on a daily basis, because the tidal inundation is muted right now into the site through that pipe system. The whole tide doesn't get into the marsh right now. But once it's opened up through an open channel, the full tide that's out in the sound will propagate into the marsh. So on a daily basis, you'll get higher, just get higher water levels in there on a daily basis due to the tide.
But it doesn't get as low. It doesn't get as low as the tide does out on the beach.
No, it doesn't get as low on the tide. And the reason it doesn't get as low is because the elevation of the channel that goes out through the beach is just a little bit below mean sea level. It's the bottom of it. So that's a limiting factor for how drained the marsh can get. It doesn't actually go the bottom of the channel out there isn't actually at low tide elevation. It's higher than that. So that's one of the reasons why you see that it's not getting as low as the tide does out in Puget Sound. Thanks for reminding me of that. So the orange line, again, that's the orange arrow is pointing to alternatives 1 and 2. And you can see there is very little difference between them. They behave essentially exactly the same as each other in terms of tidal inundation. And then the other thing I wanted to point out here with the gray arrow is the primary difference in flooding. There's 2. One I already mentioned. On the daily basis, you're going to get higher water levels in the marsh due to the tide coming in on the order of several feet, depending on what tidal phase it is. But the other difference is if you look at where the gray arrow is pointing in the top, that long, that turquoise line that takes a very long time to go down. Right now, when the marsh floods from fresh water, so a lot of water flows into the marsh from creeks, it doesn't empty very fast. There's no way for it to get out except through that pipe. And it only can get out through that pipe when the tide is kind of on the low end. So it takes a long time once that marsh fills up for all that water to escape, right? Whereas once it's opened to Puget Sound directly, you're going to have higher water levels on the daily basis. But if you have a big flood event, the very next low tide, the whole marsh will drain out. So that's the flood benefit of having it open to Puget Sound. Again, you see the tidal fluctuation causes a little higher on a daily basis, but a big flood event will not stick around for weeks, days at a time. It will be gone as the very next low tide. So that's what that's showing. And again, the tidal inundation or the water surface elevation in the marsh is the same for both alternatives. Are there any questions about that? And there's a lot on this slide. Thanks, Jessica. I don't know if this is fascinating, but hopefully
Good.
okay. Next thing I wanted, thanks, Jessica. I might need you for another one.
Okay.
And the other thing I wanted to focus in on is just, so we found there's no difference in water surface elevation between the 2 alternatives, right? The tide comes in and out in terms of water levels, exactly the same. There are some other differences though. And one of them is the velocities in the channel when it has to make the right turn to go under the bridge. So both of these figures are showing arrows that show direction of flow. And this is for a flood tide. So the water's all coming in on both of these figures from left to right. And then the colors are the magnitude velocity. So orange here that you see in the middle is about 4 feet per second. And then the kind of lighter yellows or light greens are more around 2 feet per second. And this is maximum flood tide. So this is the highest velocities that the model predicted. So it's not an everyday condition, but it will occur during peak flood, essentially. And the one thing to note is that the velocities are higher for alternative 2 than for alternative 1. And the reason is because when you dig out the marsh more with alternative 2, you actually increase the tidal prism, which is the amount of water that actually will go in and out of the opening during every tidal cycle. So you basically dug out the marsh, made a bigger bowl, more water can get in, and then more water has to go back out. And so by increasing the tidal prism and keeping the opening the same size, you're going to increase the velocities in that opening. So that's one difference between the 2 alternatives, is that you do actually increase velocities, peak velocities, through that channel. And And not just here in the corner, kind of throughout the narrower portion of the channel out over the beach, but it's easier to focus on the turn at the bridge just clearly. And they differ by about a foot per second at peak tide. So it's a reasonable increase. And then this is just a summary slide. So I have made a summary slide here, but I think I've talked about all these things. So in essence of time, I'm going to skip these. I'll come back to them if we have time or anybody has any questions. Okay, so the next slide that I want to talk about is, or the next simulation we're going to talk about is the king tide with sea level rise in the 100-year event. So the same kind of extreme event, but 2100 with 3.2 feet of sea level rise potentially being realized. So we did not, we didn't do existing conditions for this because there wasn't a whole lot of value to be added to it. But one thing I do want to point out is you'll notice that all of the waterfront area is high and dry with 3.2 feet of sea level rise, which those of you who live around here know is probably not the case. So one thing we did in the model, we kind of idealized a seawall that runs all along the front of the waterfront so that you're not going to get, our model is not going to show any flooding up and over land due to 3.2 feet of sea level rise for these simulations. And the reason we did that is we wanted to isolate what's going on in the marsh with sea level rise, number one. And number two, there's not much benefit to be had looking at just the marsh if, you know, you're allowing all of this water to just spill right over land and kind of flood downtown and get into the marsh itself. So this is showing a bit of a condition that assumes that by the time a 3.2 foot sea level rise would occur, there would be some sort of regional solution done along the waterfront that would keep the water from just flooding completely inland during one of these events. So that's why it may look different than maybe some other maps you would have seen a sea level rise at this level. So I wanted to point. Okay, so this is alternative one. And first thing to notice in plan view is you have a lot more water up here now in Shallenbarger Marsh. Obviously you have bigger water depths here at high tide. Our berm is still containing everything because we made it 16 feet high. So we purposely made it at a height where no water would be able to get out of the marsh. And one thing we've noted too is that you would have to put a berm actually a bit farther around Shallenbarger Marsh itself. Before, you remember, we just kind of had berms around Edmonds Marsh and then one here along R104. We've now bermed off Shallenbarger Marsh itself because now it's a lot more tidally influenced with 3.2 feet of sea level rise. And additional berms actually would need to be constructed here to keep water from propagating into condos and other residential areas that are in that location. And you can also see that even though we haven't dug out the Unocal site, it is now inundated at king tide with 3.2 feet of sea level rise. So that's the other thing to point out. I'm going to go back. So what I focus on next is just what's going on up here because we haven't talked about in Shallenbarger Marsh. Because I had some finite amounts of time. So I just want to talk about, there really isn't any difference in Edmonds Marsh with sea level rise than we saw on the other slide. The water surface elevations are actually exactly the same for both alternative 1 and alternative 2. You don't get a lower water level in the marsh when it's tidally connected, for alternative 2, even though you've dug out a lot of the marsh itself. And the reason that is because you've essentially changed the way the site floods. So right now, flooding in the marsh is pretty much dominated by freshwater inflows. Like it is somewhat tidally influenced, but primarily it floods because a lot of fresh water flows into the system and it can't get out, right, at high tide. And so it sticks around for some time and it can only kind of sneak out through that pipe at lower tides. But when you connect it directly to Puget Sound, you're essentially kind of bringing the ocean or Puget Sound itself into the marsh. So the marsh is now part of Puget Sound. It's a tidally dominated system. And so at high tide, if you imagine the whole marsh is underwater, right? So if you can imagine if you went out into the ocean or Puget Sound at any high tide area and dug like a 50-foot by 50-foot deep hole, the water level in Puget Sound would not go down, right? There's sort of unlimited storage in the ocean. So basically what happens is as soon as you connect any of these areas to Puget Sound directly, any excavation you do below the high tide elevation doesn't really help in terms of if you were to dig out the marsh and not connect it to Puget Sound and leave the pipe the way it is, then essentially you could improve flooding because you're not filling that all up at high tide. It has a bunch of areas to fill up the fresh water. But once it's tidally connected, intrinsically the way the site floods is totally different. And so digging out the Unocal site further doesn't help flooding. Again, lots of other benefits, but in terms of the flooding you'll see from connecting it to the sound, it doesn't have a whole lot of benefits there. Does that make sense? Okay. So with that, I just wanted to show what's going on here in Shallenbarger Marsh with sea level rise. Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Okay, so back to these plots. So again, we have a flood event showing down here when the rain comes, big flow comes into the creeks and it stops raining. And the same dotted line up there is the tide that you see going up and down in Puget Sound. So what we're showing here first is if you look at the turquoise line, which is really hard to see, right? That's the water level in Shallenbarger Marsh. So right now. So that without any sea level rise. Sorry. With it open to the sound with today's tides. So if we were open up today, Shallenbarger Marsh would not really be tidally influenced very much. Like you get a really big king tide, you might get something blip showing up, or when it rains a lot, you can see the water level goes up. So if you open the marsh up today, today's tides, Shallenbarger Marsh will only flood when it rains a lot. But that changes pretty substantially with 3.2 feet of sea level rise, and that's the orange bumps that you see in this figure now, is that once you, with sea level rise, Shallenbarger Marsh starts to become tidally influenced. So every high tide will increase the water level in the marsh. And that's what required those additional berms to be placed around them that I showed in the previous plan. So that's one thing to keep in mind in that for sea level rise doesn't just change Edmonds Marsh, it will actually move the point at which the system becomes tidally influenced upstream in Shallenbarger Creek and Marsh itself. And that area will start to be more tidally influenced than it would be today if we just opened up the marsh. Does that make sense? Does there any questions about that? No? No. Let's see. And then we think this is interesting. One more of these plots. This one is a little bit easier to see. No, I don't think, maybe I don't need you. We'll see. So I said that for that final simulation, we were interested in what would happen if you, after the site is connected to Puget Sound, you routed all of the SR 104 stormwater pipe into the marsh. 100-year discharge from that pipe is about 350 CFS, which is about twice what's coming out of any of the creeks. So it's a significant increase in inflow into the marsh if you were just take that all out of the pipe and just let it go into the marsh. If you did that with existing conditions, which I won't show you, it's not a pretty picture. It's not something you'd want to do currently. But if the site were open to Puget Sound, again, talking about that kind of unlimited storage in the ocean, now that you've connected it to Puget Sound, it looks totally different. So basically the two lines you see above up there, those are actually alternative one, which is, sorry, maybe I should have used Jessica. Sorry about that. So the orange line, which is this one right here, is alternative one without pumping the SR 104 flow through the marsh. And then the green line is when we did add the SR 104 flow to the marsh. So what you could see is that you could actually do that. You could route all that flow into the marsh. In terms of water levels, you'd have to think about velocities and maybe some other things. But in terms of water levels, you don't cause any increased flooding in the marsh by routing all that flow through it once it's open to Puget Sound. The only difference is that before you do that, in a situation where you're not routing it through the marsh drains a little bit lower during low tides. It stays a little more elevated at low tide with that amount of flow added to it. But it is something that feasibly could be done from a flooding perspective if it were restored and actually had an open channel connection. And I already talked about all these things, so I will save you all of that. And I'd rather provide more time for people to ask questions. I do have a quick overview of that contamination impacts analysis, but only just a few slides. I'll just hit the high points there. But before I jump into that, any other questions about, I guess.
I'm a slide about the velocity going under the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
Is there velocity that is of concern that it might wear away the sides of the canal, or were the data you showed, is that all in the okay zone?
Yeah, so certainly some of these velocities, I mean, they don't occur all the time, right? It occurs at peak flow and peak ebb time. So several times a day, but not constantly. And they certainly are high enough that they could erode soils. And so there would have to be some accommodation for that. And in previous modeling work and previous reports about that, there is discussion of armoring being required. Certainly the railroad bridge itself would have to have armored abutments, which they always do anyway. It's a requirement of BNSF, really, whether you need them or not most of the time. But certainly there would need to be some armoring of some of the banks of the channel, and potentially some in this straight shot as it goes out towards the beach before you could allow it. At some point, hopefully you would allow it to have some free reign. You wouldn't have to armor it. But there are certainly some sections of this that you would need to provide some sort of rock armoring or larger substrates so that it doesn't erode either the bluff that's here, or the channel itself, to the point that it would impact its performance or impact other structures. Yes.
I was just gonna add, I think maybe even the bigger problem about velocities is how much time during a tidal cycle the fish could actually use it with those velocities. Now, when you talk to the fish biologists, which I'm not one, but they say, fish are awfully clever. They'll come up to that and go, yeah, now's not the right time. They'll wait for slack tide, go in, or if that's on a flood tide, like it shows there, it probably make it through just fine. But they're, trying to get out, and it might not. I don't know. Anyway, it's about the construction of it for sure, but then also the usability of the habitat with velocities like that.
And the previous modeling work focused on that. They didn't really focus this again. This was kind of more focused on flooding. But if you look at some of the other reports, and there's a specific one, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I could get that information for folks, where there was a fish biologist who did a study who looked at, I looked at how much time a velocity was lower than a certain amount that was considered kind of a threshold for fish access. And then the fish biologist did a study to show, at least in their opinion, that there was enough time that this was accessible to fish that it did happen. So there are certainly some, 40 per second velocity out, a juvenile fish can have a pretty hard time swimming against that. But there are lots of other times where the velocity regime is fine for fish access. So, but there is a report where that was done, and it was a big focus of some of the original. I just can't remember what year it was. It's been a long time. It's been a lot of years. I can't remember which year it was.
Well, and based on some of the other work that we've done in estuaries, in intact estuaries, and actually going out and measuring velocity, and actually we had folks out observing fish populations. We do get peak flood currents, in the 5 to 6 feet per second range all the time in natural systems, and the the benefit of the natural systems is the channels are wide enough that they often have this complexity of topography. So they have these little quieter areas on the side, and fish actually tend to swim against currents is one of the kind of the big findings of that. Like that's how their gills are, designed and everything. So, so they find places to either hide, but it's a pretty short period of time that the velocities are like that strong, right? So they can wait it out, or as Phil said, they just don't go in there right away, or they find another place to hide. So overall, it doesn't. I don't think it seems like it's a concern in terms of fish specifically being able to get in and get out of this system.
And armoring and things like this are not unusual in restoration projects, because unfortunately, we can't tell BNSF to go away, and other things like that. So even today in most restoration projects, you are still doing the work around an impacted area of development or infrastructure or something to work around. So it's pretty common to have. Unfortunately, you can't always put it back the way it was. You have to work with what's here now. So it wouldn't be unusual to have to do that. Yes.
I'm just kind of curious about the height of the berm, 16 feet. I'm wondering, is that just down the road that it would be modeled again to see if 10 feet or 12 feet would be sufficient, or if it needs to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, we would probably not propose to go 16 feet right out of the gate. We could pull all the water surface elevations out of the model now to do it. We wouldn't have to do any more modeling to kind of optimize that berm height. But I think what we would propose is that sometimes it depends on the project. But one option, if you don't want to go out there and build it for 16 feet based on a sea level rise that may not occur until 2100 and may also not quite reach that height at all. There's a lot of uncertainty, and the farther you go out in time, the more uncertain it is that you can build a berm at a lower height now and just make sure that it's appropriate width, that you can build it up higher later. So just kind of an adaptive management strategy. And that's probably, if anyone were to ask me about the design moving forward, that's probably what I would recommend, is that you wouldn't go for like the Great Wall quite out of the gate. You'd go up with something that's reasonable, is affordable, but has the ability to be built higher later.
I point out that the walkway along the athletic club and along the north edge of the marsh is, I think, 12 feet. So when we say 16 feet, we're not talking about a 16-foot berm. We're talking about the difference between maybe another 2 feet or 4 feet.
Oh, thanks.
Although still, adaptive management is still helpful for capital budgets, if nothing else, is to try to, because again, it's hard as an engineer to engineer for a very uncertain design criteria. And so that's one of the reasons why adaptive management is usually a good strategy. Like we kind of convince ourselves 1 foot's pretty problem and design for that. And just make sure that you don't have to come out and dig up or remove everything you just built to build something higher, right? You can build that higher in the future. So for a berm, it's really easy. You just need to make it wide enough to build it higher. It's a little more challenging for a concrete structure, but for a berm, it's pretty easy to do that. Yes.
Yeah, I just wondered, what is the width of the channel possible under the bridge?
Oh, shoot. I knew. That's a good question. I don't have a cross section of it. Some of it, I think it's about 36 feet. So it's relatively wide. What we found is that it does attenuate the tide, but a very small amount. Like it pretty much lets the tide in the marsh, all the tide get in. It allows full tidal inundation, full connection, except at really, really high tides that occur very quickly. So the high tide comes really fast and then drops really fast. Sometimes that opening is a little too small in that amount of time to let all of the tide in, but it's a very small amount. So that does change with sea level rise, only in that if sea level rise is 3 feet, you actually start to submerge the lowest structural members of that bridge, the railroad bridge, which would probably not thrill BNSF, but that's something none of us in the room can control, right? So it's going to happen to their tracks either way. That's really the main, but for now, it's, it would be great to make it wider if we had that option, but not really a great option on the table, be very expensive. So it does pretty much allow full tidal inundation, except for some very small. In terms of water levels, in terms of velocities, Jessica's giving me an evil eye over there. So I'm not sure I add this. I'm kidding. But in terms of velocities though, and like a geomorphic behavior of a natural channel, it is too narrow theoretically for the size of the marsh. And Jessica's actually done a really good learning study where they looked at intact systems to try to figure out what is an equilibrium or natural width of channel based on the size of the marsh, that it's actually feeding or fed from. And certainly this is a little bit smaller than it should be for that reason. So it's adequate hydraulically, but in terms of like a natural system and natural geomorphology, it is too small.
But that speaks to the question somebody asked about scour protection. So that's one of the primary reasons it would need scour protection. I mean, we are not restoring this back to historic conditions. I think that's pretty clear to everybody. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have amazing value and benefits, in the constrained world that we live in.
Yeah. Yes.
Does anyone know if when the second line, BNSF line goes through, are they planning on building the second bridge to get through there? Or is that down the road a ways?
That's a
That
good
line's
question.
coming soon.
The bridges are already there.
Yeah. That's it.
For 2 tracks?
Yeah, there's.
Okay, cool.
There's actually 2 bridges.
Cool.
Yeah. So, but I'm glad that you knew.
Greg's texting me, the bridge is 35 feet. And the railroad elevation at the bridge is 16 feet. So when we talk about, with sea level rise needing to be 16 feet, we're already there for parts of it.
Well, except that you're supposed to have 3 feet of freeboard under from the bottom of the bridge just to the marks and elevation.
Yeah. Whole other conversation.
But I just want to be clear, it's not like we're going to build a 16-foot.
Yeah.
We're only talking about another 2 feet.
Well, relative to the path by the athletic club.
Right.
Along 104, it's going to look pretty high. Because that's a good 6 feet lower than that path.
Yeah, it is lower, and we'd have to tie it back in a ways, like, 104.
Yeah.
They'll make.
But hey, work.
View from.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think too, we have to remember, like, the berm that you would need now is not a huge berm. It's the sea level rise situation. And really at that point, if there's 3 foot of sea level rise, I mean, you're really talking about some sort of regional effort to address that situation.
Yeah.
This wouldn't be occurring in a vacuum as a standalone.
Curious, I should have asked this before, but did you guys do any sort of Pareto analysis or something on the likelihood of having the max king tide, the max rainfall event, all at the same time?
Yeah, I love this question. And I get it all the time. So yeah, there is a huge statistical analysis one could do. It's challenging because they're not independent events, right? And so, there's an argument to be made that it's not a 100-year event. When you add in a king tide is now less likely to occur than a 100-year event, especially for rainfall or for wind. Like how often does a 100-year wind event occur with a king tide? But, so I've been in this area for 18 years now. And I'm not even making this up, every single project that I've completed within 6 months of construction, that has occurred.
Sure.
We've gotten a huge windstorm with like the biggest tide everybody ever saw that year. Almost every single time. So the answer is actually pretty often here. It's not the same in an open coast situation. Like, although I did a lot of work in Florida for many years, and Category 5 is a 10-year return period event for the panhandle. Like, it's pretty more common than you think. So it actually happens a lot. I mean, you could do the statistics and it's beautiful math. And it might show you that it's going to happen Not very often, but it actually has occurred and tends to occur pretty often. And the thing to remember is because there's no hurricanes here, your 100-year wind speed is not that different than your 20-year wind speed. They just kind of asymptote out because you don't have hurricanes. So the wind only really generally blows that, can't get much higher. I mean, it occasionally gets pretty high, but generally you don't have hurricanes. So you don't get that much difference. So a 20-year windstorm event here is pretty significant. It can cause pretty big waves. And they last 12 hours, you're going to hit a high tide event. So it actually occurs quite often, unfortunately. I feel like I should warn people when I do projects for them now that within 6 months, if you let me design your project, I'll be dreamed pretty good.
It's all of us, because the other thing that happened this past year, we constructed a project and within 2 months, we got the bomb cyclone and we got winds out of the east, and it's an easterly facing shoreline. We do not design for easterly winds because they are nowhere. We never get strong easterly winds, never in the record have we gotten strong.
That's
Sure enough, 1 month after our project was constructed, and yeah, the shoreline got absolutely creamed.
So we always err on the side of caution. And I just
Strikes again.
Yeah.
I wouldn't couple them together if I was doing this in Mississippi, because then I'd be building a 40-foot wall instead of a 16-foot wall. But for this area, I always just assume they could happen together because it's usually a feasible thing to construct. Is there anything you wanted to add, Jessica, on the geomorphology side of it? I kind of.
No. I mean, it's I mean, that's the truth. I think just the point that we're not restoring it back to its historic conditions. There's just not the space and it is constrained, but the velocities are reasonable and it would be amazing fish habitat, So I think ultimately it's still, again, there's great benefits to it. It just, it won't have some of the same pool features and structure and things like that in the channel and off-channel habitat and, those things we see in natural systems, but
it'll function.
But it'll function. And, I think Bill made this point in the last meeting. There are very few places, right, from here south till you get way in South Puget Sound, right, that there's an opportunity to even do something of this scale. So, we'll take what we can get. So.
And the railroad bridge is already there. So I did work on Meadowdale. That's so I thought, well, let me see what time. I want to be careful of people's time. I know.
Russell, what time do we have to end?
Yeah.
7:30?
Officially 6 to 7:30, but
Okay.
we've got time until.
Okay. Well, I have a few slides on this I could go over pretty quickly, just hitting the high levels. Again, Derek Omerod from Anchor QA did this study. There is a report. It will be, available, quite a large report he did that's very detailed. So that will be available for y'all to read. So they did a study. Again, it was a contamination analysis study specifically on if we were to move forward with the restoration project, what impacts would some of the contamination, recognizing no final cleanup's been decided, but what impacts could that have to the restoration project? What would we have to consider in design is the primary point of the study. So they looked at this in terms of regulatory considerations, which I won't talk about here because that is not my forte. So that will definitely have to wait for Derek if you have a question about that. But implications of the proposed daylighting alternatives and then potential mitigation options. If there is some residual contamination, how do we design around it, design with it as part of the restoration project? You guys have probably all seen this. It's a really ugly figure. I don't want to dwell on it too much. I put 2 little orange arrows on here because that's just pointing to what I was going to talk about, which is these little, kind of orange areas in this plot. And this is a plot from I think one of our case reports, show where there's still some at the time of their sampling, right? Obviously they're redoing it. There was some residual contamination on the surface that they had determined would need engineered cover, which is essentially placement of clean materials on top so that the environment can't interact with that contamination anymore. And what you can see, especially where these 2 arrows are, is that some of these small areas are within the outlines of the channel currently, even if we don't go further into the Unicast site. So at the moment, there are still, even without expanding the restoration footprint at all based on alternative one. There are a few areas with the old data that would be, they still have some impacted sediment that the design would have to contend with if we move forward with the restoration design. And that is, that happens a lot. As I said, I used to work for Anchor QA. I still work with them quite a lot. And there's really generally a lot of projects that we've worked on where restoration has occurred, where there has been some contamination that has to be dealt with. So none of this is unusual or odd things to do, or like innovative solutions, right? It has been implemented in a lot of places before. So there's several mitigation options. So for example, they could go in, I think someone mentioned digging out 7 or 8 feet. That's like full removal, right? You go in, you remove every bit of contamination, you get it all, it's all out of there, it's pristine when you walk away. That doesn't happen very often. I'm sure it happens sometimes, but it doesn't happen often. 1, because it's very expensive, and 2, because technologically that's hard to do. It's hard to find all of the contamination, get it out of every single nook and cranny. And so so some of these mitigation options, these are all kind of with the assumption that full remediation, like no contamination being left behind, has not occurred, right? So the first one, so there's 2 kind of buckets of mitigation options. One is in the design process, and one is when you're actually doing the construction itself. And usually you kind of take a little from both of these buckets. So for design, the first thing you can do is you can try to avoid any areas of contamination. That's going to be a little bit difficult for us for this project, because as you saw in the previous slide, there's some areas, at least from what we know of now with existing data, that there is some impacted sediments within our channel. So we may not be able to completely avoid all areas. So the next bullet down is you could do the engineered cover that they are proposing in that plan, but you would have to over excavate down in the channel. So if you wanted your channel to be at elevation 5, for example, in those areas, you'd have to go down an extra couple of feet of some, that we would determine in design, and place clean cover, a back over it. And usually, and that way you would basically separate the channel from the contamination. And that can be done with just clean materials, either a combination of sands and gravels that people model to make sure the contamination can't come up through it. Sometimes there's a gravel put on top of that to keep that underlying material from eroding. Or you can also use clay liners can be placed as part of that cat material, and they basically don't allow any hydraulic connection between the contamination that's buried and the surface water in the channel. So there are some options that are used pretty effectively to basically account for any of the residual contamination that might be in our channel footprint, if that's what happens when we get to that point in the design. So there are options that have been shown to work and we could implement on this project. There's also a pretty large section in his report I won't go into, but you can also use cutoff walls. You can actually put a sheet pile wall between, if the sediments are a little deeper and they're next to your channel, you can put cutoff walls to keep some hydraulic connection from occurring, or other types of reactive barriers, like carbon and other things that actually, if the contamination goes through it, it actually kind of neutralizes it. I'm not a chemist, and I know that only works for certain contaminants, and I'm not sure which ones, but I do know that it's been used effectively in a lot of places. So the takeaway message is that if we do end up with some residual contamination within our channel footprint, there are a lot of tested and proven methods to deal with it, and it doesn't have to keep the restoration project from moving forward effectively. For construction, these are kind of things you would do. These really aren't necessarily you get to pick and choose. These are things you'll probably have to do if you're dealing with any sort of contaminated issues when you're doing the restoration work. So first, you have to have like 40-hour HAZWOPER training of all personnel that are working in those areas. So that's going to just change the contractor pool that will be doing that part of the work. You have to segregate. You're going to have to segregate soils that are known to be impacted from ones that aren't. And those will have to be tested and then sent to a different landfill or different disposal option than you would if it were not impacted sediment. And we do that a lot. So that's a pretty common thing as well. You have to manage the water. It's the one thing people don't think about. If you're digging out impacted sediments and you're going to hit groundwater, which is very likely, or surface water in this area, you have to control the discharge of that water into the sound or into other areas. Because essentially when you dig up all that sediment, it's going to get muddy. Mud's going to get in the water. The sediments will carry that residual contamination, and the water can actually carry it out of your site to other places. So water management will be something that's really important to think about during construction. And then finally, just sequencing of the construction to manage all of that tends to have to be a little bit more prescriptive when you're dealing with there's contamination on site than it would be otherwise. So sometimes it's not, you don't have to worry about this. You can write pretty loose construction specs, let the contractor do what they think is best and quickest, and that's how you get a cheaper price. But when you have some contamination, sometimes you be a little more of a dictator in the order that they're allowed to do things. That can make it a little more expensive to do the construction. So that was the end of what I had. Like I said, I can probably take a few questions on that. I just don't want to promise I'll be able to answer it, but I can, or Jessica's doing a great job of writing all this down. We can field the questions and I can get answers from Derek to folks if anyone has any questions on that part of it. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Regarding the contamination, there's also some regulatory alternatives. And as part of the project, we found an attorney that specializes in MACA, model toxics cleanup act. And he wrote a report. And there's some things we can do to negotiate with ecology. Things like negotiate a consent decree for the future owner. So anyway, there, in addition to what you do on the site, there's some legalese that we can do to protect future owners. So real quickly, what's next? So 3 weeks ago, Phil submitted the next grant application. We worked with Blue Coast to develop the scope of work. So the next step is to go to 30% pre-design. And that's what's considered, the grant agencies considered what you need to make a go, no-go decision. So at that point, when we're done with the 30% design, we'll have, the community will select an alternative and go to 30% design. And then we can do the environmental studies necessary to apply for permits and future grant activity. So what's after that? Then perhaps as early as next winter in the next RCO, that's the state grants, we could apply for acquisition. The next sequence would be acquisition, then final design, then construction, then monitoring and maintenance. And this is all this 30% design would be a 3-year project. So this is a very long time frame. So we have time for ecology to figure out how clean the site is and what needs to be done. What I'm trying to say is we have time. This is not a quick project. There are lots of public funding sources. The city is not going to be on the hook for this. The city does not have money to do this project. So we're not expecting that. There are lots of state and federal grants available. The current grant and grants for salmon recovery, grants for flood protection, grants for water quality improvement. They're all separate grant sources. And it's not all doom and gloom. there's a lot of state money and there is still federal money. The current money came from NOAA and NIFWIF. And actually, most of the money for this project came from Salesforce. So the NIFWIF grants are largely private money. Some of it is donations like Salesforce. Most of it is bad boys like Chevron that have had to pay a fine. And that money is then turned over to NIFWIF and they can dole it out in grants. So we're hopeful that we'll have grants available. We know there'll be state grants available and there will be some federal grants available. So that's it.
Can I add something on the funding? If you didn't know, the city has a special Marsh fund. We've been accepting donation. I mean, you guys look like high rollers to me. Or maybe you know some high rollers that would be interested in helping worthwhile project like this. It isn't going to pay for a substantial portion of a huge project, but when you go to apply for grants, when you ask for funding, if you can show you have access to your community, you've gotten donations from 700 people, they may have been small amounts of money, but we have collected quite a few contributions from people that were interested in helping us out. So yeah, think about it. If you're giving money, anything, that's something you can put on your list. I'm not accepting any checks this evening, but I just thought I'd mention that. And if you know somebody that might like to support a project like this, maybe somebody you work for, an employer or something, just thought I'd say that.
Yeah, that's
It's
good.
very helpful
Yeah,
money.
yeah.
Any other comments, questions?
Could you kind of briefly describe what the difference is between a 30% design and 100% design? Is it just the level of detail?
You want to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, it's the level of detail.
Yeah, I can take that one. Depends on the project. For things like roads and bridges, WashDOT has really prescriptive things. But in general, a 30% design is generally when you've collected all of the data you need to actually do the design. For instance, you've done geotechnical work if you needed to know if something would settle, and you've got survey, and you've done modeling, and you have a design that you know is technically and from an engineering constructability perspective feasible the way that you're showing it on the drawings. And it usually comes with a report that's called like a basis of design report that explains how you got to all of that stuff you're showing in the drawings. So that's like a 30% design.
Okay.
Then it can go to a 60, 90, 98. I mean, there's a lot of numbers in between, but by the time you get to 100% final design, that's ready for construction. So like all of the drawings will show everything a contractor would need to build it. You have what's called technical specifications, which is a big long document that tells the contractor every material that they need to use, how they're supposed to build it, how they're going to get paid for it, how you're going to measure all of that stuff in order to pay for it. So that's the difference. 30% design is usually just the design, but it is backed by all of the engineering and scientific information. So, you know it can be done. But then the final design is what city would actually put out on a bid and a contractor would bid on, and they would use that, all of the documents from that 100% design to actually build it.
And you had said that, once you have the 30% design, that's when the go, no go decision is made. And is that the city's decision, or is it who's let's go?
We don't really care if it's the city or not. It could be a state agency. It could be, we're not committing the city. The city has already signed an interlocal agreement with WashDOT for the first right to purchase. And the legislature has put it in the budget bill, first right of purchase to Edmonds. So the city has made it clear it's their goal, but it doesn't have to be the city. So, and on the 30% design, you know what the alternative is, you know what it's going to look like, where it's going to be, you'll know how high any berm would have to be you'll know what it's gonna look like. But you won't have all the detail that a contractor would.
I might just mention too, what you said is exactly right. Type, size, and location is kind of one way to think about it. It's, you've thought about the big issues, you know what you want to build. It's probably at the 30% design level, you really get an idea, plus or minus a fair amount, but the cost of the project. And also, if somebody's going to give you, because to get to 30% design, you may well spend 60% of the money. Just saying. And so if they're going to give you that much money to do the 30% design, you got them you're hooking them then. So these grant people that are funding that 30% design, they're pretty much telling you that, yeah, if it works out, that looks feasible after 30%, we're gonna be there to help you.
It's also the design you need to shop it around for grants because they want enough detail that they can see what the habitat aspects and the fish benefits are, not us just waxing poetic about what they would be, but like they want to be able to physically see it. And so some of the grant funding that Bill mentioned, there are reviewers, like there's a salmon recovery funding board. There's a set of reviewers who go around sound and review panels reviews projects from a technical perspective. They need community support, they need city support, they need partnerships, all of those things as well as the design being sound. And you consider all the alternatives, it's as big as you could go kind of thing, so from looking at it from that perspective too. So
There might be a lot of people saying yes.
There might be a lot of people saying yes. Yeah, and jumping in at that point.
Well, why don't we, Russell, Rob, Phil, any other comments? Or should we just close this and we can stick around for a few minutes if you have more questions? We're getting close to it.
I just wanted to remind folks that we got those Title VI surveys over there, completely voluntary, but again, they're helpful for us in the future to measure how well we're doing at reaching all members of the community. And then also, I've got my business card over there. If you have any questions that you didn't want to share in a public setting, my email address is in there. You can contact me with those questions, or if you just don't think of anything until later on, same case, my contact information is over there. But thank you. Thanks for attending.
Thanks for being great.
Yeah.
The other hand, take towards the market. Getting funny now, it's